Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show in Glasgow at the UN Climate Summit. Earlier today, a draft agreement was released calling on nations to strengthen their climate plans and to accelerate the phasing out of coal as well as subsidies for fossil fuels. The draft also urges wealthy nations to, quote, urgently scale up financial support for developing countries to help them adapt to the climate crisis. A key part of the draft calls on nations to make tougher pledges to cut emissions by the end of 2022, 3 years earlier than scheduled. Greenpeace issued a statement saying, quote, this draft deal is not a plan to solve the climate crisis. It's an agreement that will all cross our fingers and hope for the best, they said. This comes as a new report by the group Climate Action Tracker estimates world temperatures are on track to rise by 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels based on current emissions pledges. That's far higher than the 1.5-degree goal set at the Paris talks. We now go inside the COP to Glasgow, where we're joined by the Nigerian environmental leader and poet Nnimmo Bassey. He's the director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation and author of a number of books, including Oil Politics, Echoes of Ecological Wars, and To Cook a Continent, Destructive Extraction and Climate Crisis in Africa. Nnimmo Bassey, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you respond to the draft report? Where's the enforcement, and what about the goals that have been set in the midst of this climate emergency?
Thank you very much, Amy. It's very clear that this COP is going to end the same way other COPs have ended previously, with very little ambition, with very little seriousness, and with a lack of focus on the fact that we are in a planetary emergency. For the first time, however, they talk of phasing out some part of fossil fuel, but then they're choosing and picking. The whole world knows that the climate crisis we are facing today is being exacerbated by the burning of fossil fuel. So saying you should phase out coal, then only phase out subsidies for fossil fuel means that this COP believes that fossil fuel use in energy production, in whatever, should continue. In other words, that the carbon budget is something that can be toyed with. So this is extremely disappointing. And the only hope we have is that this is a draft document, but the tendency is that the draft document may be further watered down so that final document may actually come out to say, don't phase out anything, just remove subsidies. But this is nothing that is binding, nothing that can be, anybody can be held to account for. That is why, at the same time, we're seeing the kind of contributions and proposals made by government to cut emissions. They are now talking about net zero, net emission reduction. They're not talking about actual emission reduction. They're not talking about stopping emissions at source. They're talking about how to continue with business as usual while showing means and ways of capturing equivalence of the carbon they're emitting. And so the document itself shows clearly that those who are drafting it are drafting as if they're drafting for other people to implement. There's no force behind what is being proposed. For example, it expresses regret that industrialized rich nations are unable to raise the climate finance target of just a mere $100 billion. And that is really, it's a disappointment, because it's not for lack of funds that this money is not being raised. The industrialized nations, they spend over close to $2 trillion US in military warfare every year. And so looking for $100 billion shouldn't be a thing that they will scratch about and keep procrastinating or try to make it as loans to poor, vulnerable nations that are already being flooded, that are already facing serious climate impact. So I see the draft agreement, the draft pact, or whatever they may call it, draft decision, as an indication of lack of seriousness. And it's a big threat to those who are already on the front lines suffering impacts of global warming.
And Nnimmo Bassey, could you talk about the impact of all of the fossil fuel lobbyists that have been at this gathering? A Global Witness estimates that at least 503 fossil fuel lobbyists were granted access to COP26. was it more of a carbon stock exchange than it was actually a meeting of the people of the world to figure out what to do about climate change?
Clearly, with the having so many fossil fuel company delegates at the COP is a clear indication that we can't really expect anything good from this COP. The fossil fuel industry have captured the COP over the years. They've been supporting the COP, sponsoring the COP, advertising the COP. This year, there's less of the advertisement, but they're all here, over 500 delegates. Far more than many countries' delegates put together. This overwhelming presence, again, validates the suspicion and the fact that the COP is not really serious about tackling global warming. And if they're not serious to tackle global warming, if they keep depending or listening to the fossil fuel industry, we don't see how they're going to do what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is to keep fossils in the ground and then rapidly move away from the civilization that's driven by petroleum resources and by coal and by gas. The presence of this group of people and the financial institutions backing them is really very disturbing and very troubling. Here we are today, we're hearing, for example, the fossil fuel industry is planning to invest about $250 billion over the next 1 decade in Africa and about $1.4 trillion by the year 2050. All these don't paint a good picture for the future. It's like they're looking for profit, for speculation today, and they don't just care what happens tomorrow.
And what about those who say that the very process, the structure of COP dooms it to failure because you must have consensus of all of the nations rather than a majority rule? Consensus means minority rule because 1 or 2 nations can stop the process. How does this affect the majority of the nations of the world who may have different perspectives from the giant industrial polluting nations?
Working on consensus rather than majority vote is one of the things that people see as beautiful about the COP process, but the entire United Nations Framework Convention on climate change processes. But this concept of consensus was shattered in the COP at Cancun. At Cancun, at least one nation, which was Bolivia, stood up against the agreement, and they were just pushed aside, and then they went ahead to celebrate the adoption of the Cancun outcome. And so consensus here has a peculiar meaning, defined by those who are driving the COP, the presidents of the COP, and those who are organizing it. And it is not in the interest of the vulnerable nation. It's not about listening to those who are suffering grave impacts. Just imagine the fact that today, the world is celebrating or accepting 1.5, the 40 Paris target, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, and now estimates show that the nationally determined contributions would amount to about 2.4, 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial level. What does that leave Africa? For Africa, that would mean at least more than 3 degrees Celsius temperature, and that means setting the continent on fire. It means just sacrificing the continent, and yet we believe that these things are tolerable. This is, I believe, criminal, to say the least.
Nnimmo Bassey, the text doesn't mention the contentious Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which would establish the rules of a global market for buying and selling carbon. Can you explain this in lay terms for people to understand your thoughts on that and where you think this is ending up?
Well, the issue of bringing carbon markets into the COP is also one of those issues that kind of pretends to push the idea, or to pushing the idea that the market can solve a problem that has been created by the market. It's completely impossible. The market is all about profit, it's about power, it's about control, it's about domination, and this is not a way to build solidarity or cooperation between countries in the world today. And so we've gone before, in terms of carbon market and so on and so forth, we had elements like carbon trading, like reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And now to make it sound better, to make it sound more acceptable, they talk about net zero. So pricing carbon is just about pricing hot air. That's what it means. It's just a device It's a device for avoiding action. And so you could say, well, I could keep on polluting. Then some trees we paid for a forest in the Congo or in Uganda or in somewhere in Amazon that is not already been burned down. And then you continue with pollution, continue consuming things at levels that are intolerable. So the whole carbon market mechanism is about avoiding action, avoiding climate action, but then profiting from the inaction and profiting from the misery of majority people in the world today.
And Nnimmo, could you talk about two of the world's largest polluting nations are absent from the COP this year, China and Russia. Could you talk about China's role, especially in Africa, with its Belt and Road policies and also with its voracious desire for more minerals?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I don't know if you heard me. I asked you about the absence of China and Russia from the COP this year and China's role in Africa in terms of the environmental harm.
Yes, thank you. It's really very concerning that the big polluters such as Russia and China, the leaders, would actually stay away from the COP. It speaks very poorly of their leadership and of their concern about what is clearly a global problem. Many other leaders consider climate change as national warming rather than global warming, and that is why the Paris Agreement based its action on national determined contribution rather than globally, scientifically determined decisions about who would cut at to what level. Now, China is overrunning Africa, driving deforestation in the continent, investing in fossil fuel facilities development, exploitation pipelines, for example. They're investing in the pipeline that will take oil from very waxy oil from Uganda to a seaport in Tanzania for export. And this is something that's really threatening not just climate change, but the livelihoods of millions of Africans who live in the Rift Valley and who depend on freshwater system in the Lake Victoria Basin in East Africa. So right across the continent, the influence of China and the investment in fossil industry development on the continent is a big problem for in terms of global warming, in terms of livelihoods, and in terms of local economies. Because right on that continent, I would say, the total workforce of the continent, out of the total workforce, less than 1% of Africans are working in that sector. So it doesn't in any way multiply or add up to the local economies. It's just another wave of exploitation, and that's what China is driving on the continent. Russia on its own is pushing old technology for nuclear power in some places on the continent, and I believe that they ought to have been on the table. They should face the nations that they are in whose territory they are taking action that is compounding the crisis, and not stay away and just send delegates to come here and talk to the rest of the people.
Nnimmo, as we wrap up, number one, can you describe the real effects of the climate emergency on the continent of Africa? And two, what gives you hope? When we see you every year at the climate summits, we've been together from Copenhagen on. You've been arrested at protests. You keep going. What gives you hope?
Well, the impacts of global warming on the continent of Africa is enormous. One thing is that Africa is right at the center of the world, have the large chunk of the continent right on the equator, so the temperature impact on the continent is far above the global average. So global averages personally are very threatening to me and to others on the continent. Now, again, the continent is surrounded by water bodies, so there's serious sea level rise impact. Is being predicted by the IPCC to have higher levels of impact, apart from the Pacific Island states, on the continent. Already, a place like Nigeria is losing about 2 meters every year to coastal erosion due to sea level rise. And this is having grave impact already on communities, on infrastructure, and it's a big problem. Now, what gives me hope? I'm thinking that this may be, I've been on most COPs and we've met, and I really enjoyed, I appreciate the amount of influence and that you're helping to promote the right solutions from these COPs. But this may well be my last attendance at a COP. if the process continues to go in the wrong direction. But the COP provides a very good opportunity for movements and civil society actors to meet outside. And right now, as you sit in the COP in Glasgow, there are very real, grounded discussions going on in the People's Summit outside of the COP. And I'm looking forward to a time when the outside will be the arena for decision-making, just as we find in Cochabamba, but this time enforceable decision-making, because the COP is more or less a playing ground for politicians.
We want to thank you so much, Nnimmo Bassey, for being with us, Nigerian environmental activist and poet, director of Health of Mother Earth Foundation in Nigeria. In 2010, he won the Right Livelihood Award, author of a number of books, including Oil Politics, Echoes of Ecological Wars, and To Cook a Continent, Destructive Extraction and Climate Crisis in Africa. Coming up, we look at the global climate wall, a new report examining how the world's wealthiest nations are prioritizing borders over climate action. Stay with us.
It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees. 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 I wanna see this world, I wanna see it boil. I wanna see this world, I wanna see it boil. It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees. It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees.
4 Degrees by Anoni here on Democracy Now! Climate Countdown. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan